What's up everyone, this is White Pointer bringing you a video version of one of my top 10 lists published on Game FAQs. This one is the top 10 facts you may not know about the Mega Drive/Genesis. If you prefer to read this list rather than watch it, the link to the written version is in the description. During the early 90s, many gamers around the world preferred Sega's 16-bit console, known as the Mega Drive in Japan and PAL territories, and the Genesis in North America. Sega gave Nintendo one heck of a fight during this period of time, and the system was home to many great and memorable games of its own. This was the era where Sega had their golden age, and many gamers have fond memories of the system. So now it's your turn, Sega fans. Here's a list of facts that you may not know about your favourite console. Of course, as I said in my SNES list, I know you viewers are a smart bunch, so maybe you know some of this stuff already. Even if you do though, I hope you still find this list interesting. Let's get started! So I guess many gamers would know by now that Sega's 16-bit console was originally released in Japan as the Mega Drive. It retains its branding in most other countries around the world, but for North America it was renamed to the Genesis. I've already covered in detail the story surrounding the rename in the previous written list of mine, and I'll leave the link to that in the description, but this is the short version. While no official reasoning from Sega has ever been provided, it's commonly believed that another company in the USA had already trademarked the name Mega Drive. In addition to this, Sega of America co-founder David Rossini was apparently also not a fan of the name, as Mega and Drive were both words that were usually used in the context of personal computers, and the console was not a PC. They apparently chose the name Genesis to reflect that it was a new beginning for them. However, this wasn't the only case of the console being renamed. The other name some readers may be familiar with, particularly if you hail from a South American country, is the Super Mega Drive. While this seems like only a subtle rename on the surface, the console itself was marketed and distributed by Tectoy, who put their own branding on it and even eventually released their own custom, primarily white-coloured design for it. From there, it gets somewhat weirder. Japan and South Korea for a long time in history were in conflict, and while the relations have been repaired these days, there was still some tension in the late 80s and early 90s. The South Korean public would not have taken kindly to an influx of Japanese products showing up on store shelves. So, Japanese companies generally needed to partner with a South Korean company to sell their wares in the country. Sega in particular teamed up with Samsung, and when they released the original Master System, it was renamed to the Samsung Game Boy. So, when the Mega Drive hit the market, they called it the Samsung Super Game Boy. Perhaps Sega and Samsung eventually realised this was a confusing name, given Nintendo, who themselves had partnered with Hyundai, as weird as that sounds, had a very similarly named product, because they decided another change of moniker was necessary a couple of years later. They renamed the Game Boy to Aladdin Boy, and the Super Game Boy to the Super Aladdin Boy. Nice work guys, that's much better. These days, it's considered normal for console makers to release a new revision of their systems mid-cycle, be it with updated hardware or a redesign. This is actually a practice that's been going on for decades though, even as far back as Mattel releasing multiple models of the Intellivision. Sega decided they would get in on this action, and so throughout the Mega Drive's lifetime, the system saw multiple different models hit the market. Model 1 is arguably the most recognisable, and also arguably the best. More on that in a minute. This had a general rectangular body with the right side of the console having a circular or disc shape around where the cartridge slotted in. This model included a volume slider, headphone jack, and 9-pin EXT port, and was the original release of the system. 1988 in Japan, and 1989 to 1990 elsewhere. Model 2, also called the Mega Drive 2, or simply Genesis, as opposed to Sega Genesis, released in 1993, and was redesigned to have a generally square-shaped body and a less power-hungry motherboard. This version removed the volume slider, headphone jack, and EXT port, and altered the back connectors to support stereo sound. However, This model is often criticised for having poorer, distorted audio quality compared to the original. A Genesis 3 was later released in 1998 with a much smaller and more compact design, but this was manufactured by Majesco Entertainment, not Sega, as Sega had discontinued the console by then. It didn't stop there though. Sega eventually released the Genesis CDX, or Multi-Mega, that was a hybrid system combining the original console with the Sega CD, or Mega CD. Sega also released what they called the Terra Drive, exclusively in Japan, that basically combined a Mega Drive with a computer. The last of Sega's first-party revisions was the Nomad, essentially a portable version of the console that was technically the successor to the Game Gear. It had a 3.25-inch screen and supported all original Mega Drive/Genesis games that didn't require add-ons. In addition to these, there were many other revisions created by third parties, including the aforementioned Genesis 3, later revisions of the Super Mega Drive, Wonder Mega, CSD GM1, Laser Active, Mega PC, and Firecore. The SNES ultimately beat the Mega Drive in sales, if you're talking about worldwide numbers. The SNES sold 49.1 million units, and the Mega Drive/Genesis for a long time had quoted sales figures of around 29 million units. However, this difference was inflated somewhat due to how ridiculously popular the SNES was in Japan. Nintendo's console sadly trounced Sega's in their home country, selling almost 5 times as many systems. In fact, the Mega Drive wasn't even second place in that race, finishing a distant third behind the NEC TurboGrafx-16, called the PC Engine in Japan. Whatever the reason was, Japan was just not interested in the Mega Drive. Outside of Japan, however, it was a much different story. The TurboGrafx-16 was commercially unsuccessful, and Sega started to push their authority. In Europe in particular, Sega outsold not just NEC's console, but comfortably surpassed Nintendo's as well, selling almost twice as many units. In Europe especially, the Sega Mega Drive ruled the roost. Sales numbers for the Americas, however, are a little more fuzzy, and it's not helped by the fact that Sega have never actually publicly released their sales figures. Some reports indicate that the Genesis outsold the SNES by up to 25%, helped by the system being massively popular in South America and Brazil in particular. Other sources put the Genesis slightly behind the SNES. Further muddying the waters is that the system was officially discontinued by Sega in 1997, but the Genesis 3, manufactured by Majesco, and the Super Mega Drive, manufactured by Tectoy, both mentioned earlier, continued to be produced and sold after Sega stepped away from it, with Tectoy in particular still selling systems more than 20 years later. Whether these numbers, or indeed the sales of any third-party product, should be included in the actual total sales when the systems weren't produced or supported by Sega is a subject of debate. That earlier mentioned figure of 29 million came from a source that quoted sales figures up to the end of 1994, and the system undoubtedly sold more units than that. Sega sold the console until 1997 after all. Some sources estimate the total worldwide sales of all Mega Drive/Genesis revisions, plus add-ons, to be very close to, and perhaps even slightly eclipse, the SNES's worldwide total, while others estimate it to be around 40 million. However you look at it though, the fight was a lot closer than you may have initially believed. In my previous list about SNES facts, I covered how Nintendo designed the SNES to accommodate special coprocessors that were included on the game cartridges to enhance the abilities of the console. As these enhancement chips started to become more common, and especially when games like Star Fox that utilised the Super FX chips started hitting the market, Sega became concerned that it made the Mega Drive look notably outdated in comparison. Not to be outdone, Sega got to work on their own version of the technology. Their answer was the Sega Virtual Processor, or SVP. Like the Super FX, this chip was included on the cartridge board and allowed the system to render real-time polygons. Thanks to the faster processor inside the Mega Drive, it was able to do it at a much faster and more stable frame rate than the SNES could too. However, this tech came at a price, as it was very expensive to actually produce. Only one game was ever commercially released using the SVP chip, and that was Virtua Racing. It retailed for $100 US, which made it the most expensive Sega cartridge ever sold at the time. There were plans to bring Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA to the system that would utilise the chip as well, but those games were moved to the upcoming Saturn instead. While the tech was impressive, despite the fact it was only used for one game, this was unfortunately one of the pieces behind the start of Sega's downfall. Between the SVP, the 32X, and the botched launch of the Saturn, Sega started confusing gamers with all of these different options that seemed like they did very similar things, and started losing the goodwill and trust they had built for so many years. Even in the early 90s, EA was young, but still one of the biggest publishers around, and they had been trying to negotiate with Sega for almost a year in regards to licensing agreements, cartridge manufacturing, and royalty rates. Frustrated that Sega was not willing to come to an agreement, EA programmers found a way to publish their games to the system by reverse engineering it, bypassing Sega's usual approval process and cutting Sega out of the profits entirely. Once they figured out how to do that, they secretly started working on a number of games. EA then secretly met with Sega a day before CES in 1990 and showed them what they had done. They essentially gave Sega an ultimatum, agreed to meet their demands, or they would start independently licensing games for the system. If Sega wanted to continue having complete control over their platform, they didn't have much of a choice but to concede. The new licensing deal meant that EA could approve their own titles and could make as many games as they wanted for the console. They also had more control over manufacturing, which resulted in EA cartridges having a yellow strip down one side as an identifier. Lastly, of course, the royalty rates were much better from EA's perspective. A day later, during the actual CES trade show, EA showed off the games they had been working on. Somewhat ironically, this deal turned out to be very beneficial for Sega, as EA brought their large catalogue of licensed sports games to the system, including the highly lauded John Madden Football and FIFA series. These sports games turned out to be a major selling point for the Genesis in North America and the Mega Drive in Europe, and this was one of the big reasons the console sold as well as it did in those regions. Back in 1992, a little game called Mortal Kombat was released in arcades. The game was eventually ported onto many home systems, including MS-DOS, Amiga, Game Boy, Game Gear, and Sega CD. However, the two most discussed versions of the game were those on the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive, with the former famously censoring various aspects of the game, replacing blood with sweat and replacing several fatalities, and the latter also being censored by default by providing a cheat code that enabled the blood and gore. This, combined with the game's realistic-looking digitised graphics, attracted the attention of the media and governments. Mortal Kombat, along with the Sega CD FMV game Night Trap, were the focal point of federal hearings in late 1993 and early 1994, where the outcome was that the video game industry was ordered to create their own classification system, or the government would do it for them. However, Sega had apparently already predicted this and had been using their own classification system since June 1993, about 6 months before the hearings even started. This classification system, called the Video Game Rating Council, or VRC, was applied to games published on Sega systems and had 3 ratings: GA, General Audience, MA13, and MA17. When the court order came through, Sega put their hand up, saying they already had a system in place that other companies could use. However, those other companies were reluctant to allow Sega to be in charge of video game ratings, and Sega's system itself was criticised for being inconsistent and vague. This led to the industry forming the Interactive Digital Software Association, later renamed to the Entertainment Software Association, who then put a proposal to US Congress for a new classification system. The Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or ESRB, was then founded in September 1994, and Sega's VRC system was discontinued. Mortal Kombat was then, unsurprisingly, the first game to be classified under the new system.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
Blast processing was a phrase Sega threw around a lot during its aggressive advertising campaign against Nintendo, along with others such as Genesis Does What Nintendo Don't and Think Fast. At the time, many passed it off as just some marketing babble that didn't really mean anything. Except it did. Well, kind of. It actually originally referred to a specific programming technique that developers could use to get a little more out of the console's hardware. Sega senior producer at the time, Scott Bayless, explained what it meant and how it came about a few years ago. Marty Franz, Sega technical director, discovered that you could do this nifty trick with the display system by hooking the scanline interrupt and firing off a DMA at just the right time. The result was that you could effectively jam data onto the graphics chip while the scanline was being drawn, which meant you could drive the DACs with 8 bits per pixel. Assuming you could get the timing just right, you could draw 256 colour static images. There were all kinds of subtleties to the timing, and the trick didn't work reliably on all iterations of the hardware, but you could do it, and it was cool as heck. When Bayless was speaking to Sega's PR, they asked him what was interesting about developing for the platform from a technical perspective. He mentioned they could blast data into the DACs, and the PR guys loved the word blast. From that, the term blast processing was born, though Bayless never really liked the phrase, describing it as ghastly. So why did I say kind of earlier? Well, as Bayless actually says in that quote, the trick didn't actually work on all variations of the hardware, so it was never really actually utilised to the extent that the advertising campaign would have had you believe, though Sonic the Hedgehog 2 did use it to some degree. For this reason, the phrase is instead more commonly used to refer to the difference in CPU speed. It's no secret that the clock speed of the CPU in Sega's console was faster than Nintendo's. In fact, it was more than twice the speed of their rivals. This made the console the most ideal platform for genres such as fast-paced shoot-em-ups like the Thunder Force series. The character of Sonic the Hedgehog is an institution in the video games industry. He's seemingly been around forever. There aren't too many video game characters that have been around as long as he has and are still getting new games made. I guess many gamers, especially those who may not have been around in the late 80s when the Mega Drive/Genesis launched, just naturally assume that Sonic in some form has been the mascot for Sega basically since the beginning of their video game business, much like Mario has been for Nintendo. The fact is, that's not actually the case. When the Mega Drive launched in 1988, Sonic the Hedgehog did not exist. The Mega Drive was actually Sega's third console, being the successor to the Master System, which itself was the successor to the SG-1000. There were no Sonic games on any of these platforms until the original Sonic the Hedgehog debuted on the Mega Drive in 1991, where it was then oddly also backported to the Master System. Prior to the release of Sonic the Hedgehog, the packing game included in the box for the Mega Drive was Altered Beast. So who then was Sega's mascot before Sonic? It was Alex Kidd. The Master System launched in 1985, and the first Alex Kidd game, Alex Kidd in Miracle World, released for the system in the following year. From there, he had 4 more games on the Master System and 1 on the Genesis, before that blue hedgehog came along and usurped him. Sadly, we never saw another game starring Alex Kidd after that, though he has made cameo appearances in a number of games since then. Interestingly, a little spaceship named Opa Opa from the game Fantasy Zone was considered Sega's mascot before Alex Kidd. So, it was the Mega Drive/Genesis that introduced the world to one of the most recognisable mascots in video games, and not one of Sega's earlier consoles. Also, we now know that Sonic is a big bully. If you ever needed more evidence of how ahead of the curve Sega was, Sega actually released official wireless controllers for the Mega Drive/Genesis. Called the Remote Arcade Pad, or the Infrared Control Pad in Power Regions, they were launched in 1994, 8 years before Nintendo would release the Wavebird controller. This system came with a receiver that plugged into the 2 controller ports on the front of the console, and 2 6-button wireless control pads that had switches on the bottom to set them to player 1 or player 2. By all accounts, these actually worked really well, with no noticeable input lag. Although, because it used infrared technology, the controllers did need to maintain line of sight to the receiver. The controllers also required batteries, making them a little bulkier than their cable counterparts. The system worked on all first-party revisions of the hardware, and even the third-party Genesis 3. It didn't stop there though. Even before the wireless controllers, Sega released a motion-based control peripheral called the Sega Activator in 1993. This was a large octagon that was placed on the floor, with the player standing in the middle of it. The device basically shot infrared beams upwards, and the player would essentially send control signals to the system by moving their limbs over the invisible beams. Each side of the octagon corresponded to a normal controller input: up, down, left, right, A, B, C, and start. The device was marketed primarily as something that made fighting games and beat-em-ups more immersive, and several games, including Eternal Champions, Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition, and Streets of Rage 3 were partly designed with it in mind. However, as it turns out, the activator was not precise or fast enough for these types of games. This was in effect a very early precursor to Kinect, though like Kinect, it never really took off and was discontinued, although in Activator's case, it only took a matter of months rather than years. Still, it shows you how forward-thinking Sega was at the time. Here's something that might blow your mind. The Mega Drive, once upon a time, actually had limited online capabilities. It was exclusive to Japan and didn't last particularly long, but it had it. This was possible through a first-party peripheral released in 1990 called the Mega Modem that plugged into the back of the Mega Drive using the 9-pin expansion port and then plugged into the phone line. The product came with a special cartridge that was needed to access Sega's service called MegaNet. At its core, you connected to MegaNet and were able to download and play games, many of which were exclusive to the service and never saw a retail release. Some of the games included Sonic Eraser, Putter Golf, Columns, Paddle Fighter, Fatal Labyrinth, and Flicky. However, it was unique in the fact that the modem also provided the functionality to connect to someone else's console who also had the modem through the phone line and play each other in a peer-to-peer setup. Due to having several seconds of lag and the cost associated with phone calls, only a small number of games supported the feature. In fact, only around 24 games were ever available or supported it, due to what seemed like a lack of interest from Sega themselves. It wasn't really until the X-Band came along a few years later that true online play was possible, but it was still pretty remarkable what Sega managed to achieve in 1990. The service was shut down and the modem discontinued after only around a year, and in fact, later models of the Mega Drive removed the 9-pin expansion port entirely, making it impossible to use the Mega Modem even if you wanted to. There were plans to bring the service to North America, rebranded as Telegenesis, but this never happened. Sega were reluctant to release it without games, and developers were reluctant to make games without the service. However, MegaNet did resurface in Brazil in 1995, though it was entirely handled by Tectoy and required a separate proprietary modem device. Although MegaNet and the Mega Modem were commercial failures, they were a precursor to the much more successful Sega Channel that launched in North America in 1994 and was active until 1998. This did not allow online multiplayer and functioned kind of similar to Nintendo's Satellaview. It allowed you to download and play games on your Genesis that were on a monthly rotation, except it connected via cable rather than satellite. So there you have it, the top 10 facts you may not know about the Mega Drive/Genesis. Hopefully you learned something from this list, but of course, as I said in the introduction, maybe you did know these facts already. So if you did, I hope you were at least entertained. I can only put 10 items on this list, so if I've missed a little known fact about the Mega Drive/Genesis that you think I should have included in this list, please let me know. Drop some comments below and give me a thumbs up if you liked the video. Thanks for watching!